the underlying assumption that drives Mary Gentili's work is rooted in the fact that for most of the situations we face, we actually know what the right thing is to do. And so instead of obsessing about the use of 55 philosophical frameworks or some other metric for thinking about what the right thing is to do, the issue is knowing what the right thing is to do doesn't necessarily mean we act on that. And the question of figuring out how to act on knowledge we have becomes a much more central part of the equation, particularly where the work got started, which was in the efforts of being able to provide another set of frameworks for people who were thinking about beginning to adjust and influence behavior in the business community over the short and long term. So I'm thrilled that Mary Gentili is with us tonight. I'm also thrilled that Mary Gentili is at Babson, and I'm even more thrilled that I've had the pleasure of knowing and working with Mary for, now we discovered again tonight, about 20 years. Mary and I met years and years ago at the Harvard Business School, where she had a large part of the responsibility first for all of the course development work that revolved around the first major ethics initiative that the Harvard Business School took on, and then gravitated from there to a major course development and teaching initiative around diversity at the institution. So two issues that I think are near and dear to many of our hearts as we think about the process of making advances in both of those critical areas. Several years ago, Mary left the safe environs of Harvard and made the transition to a venture with Yale and the Aspen Institute that gave rise to this Giving Voice to Values program that she'll talk about tonight. That Giving Voice to Values program actually made that gravitational shift just about a year ago now to Babson. So the locus of that activity now is Babson and will continue to be so as it adds to the repertoire of capabilities we're trying to build broadly under the umbrella of the academic agenda and action agenda we have at the school. And hopefully you'll get a sense of the fact that not only is this terribly relevant to the questions of ethics we've been talking about, but is also inextricably tied to the agendas that all of you should be thinking about as you think about the next generation of activities you engage in to build your leadership capabilities and the capabilities of others as well who work with you and for you. So without any further ado, let me turn it over to Mary Gentili.
Thank you, Len. Can you all hear me? I'm wired? Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Len. I'm actually also really thrilled to be working with Len again after all that time, and especially thrilled to be at Babson and now to be talking to a group of students who include Wellesley and Olin as well. So I'm really happy to be here. So what I want to do, everyone's always shocked that I don't use PowerPoints, but what I want to do is just tell you some stories. And the stories I'm going to tell you are about the thinking, the rationale, the drivers behind the development of the Giving Voice to Values approach to thinking about values-driven leadership. I'll tell you a little bit about how it happened, how it came to be. Some of that's personal, some of that's professional, some of that is much broader. And then I'll also talk to you a little bit about what actually exists now and how it's being embraced and taken up around the world, actually, at this point. So, but let me just go back and start with some stories. So basically, this process began for me in the mid-'80s when I first went to work at the Harvard Business School, as Len was talking about. And I had come out of a background, a doctorate in literature and film. So, you know, what brave new world had I stumbled into? Harvard Business School. I was kind of taken aback by the whole place. But I remember going to the first orientation for, you know, an incoming cohort of MBA students. And at that time, an incoming cohort was about 800 students. It's gone up now, but they would bring the class together in orientation. And they had this little ritual they would do. And I've learned since then that it's not unique to HBS. It happens at other schools. It happens at law schools. Perhaps some of you have experienced it. But it was new to me. It wasn't something you ever did in a doctoral program in literature. And what they would do is they would say, look to the left of you, look to the right of you. These people are going to be your career network for the rest of your lives. And this was the dean saying this to the group of students. And the point was you're in a really select group, you know, so some of it was to puff you up and make you feel good about being there, and to make everyone feel like we're special. The other piece was, build relationships. This is a really important value of your educational experience here. The other message was don't be too irritating, you want to maintain these relationships so you can draw on them later. So a few years later, when I was part of the first group of faculty at the business school who were trying to develop a required curriculum around ethics and leadership, we thought maybe we need to morph that message a little bit. And so what we did is when we brought the students into their first ethics and business class discussion, which was about 90 students in a class at that time, we would say, look to the left of you, look to the right of you. After you've gone through this course experience, this will be your network for throughout your life. Whenever you encounter an ethical conflict in your business careers, and you will, these are people that you've already had the experience of speaking out loud about what is the right thing to do, and you've come out to them as somebody who wants to struggle with what's right in these situations. And so you can use them as a sounding board. You can call them up when you're trying to figure out how to figure out what's right. So we thought, well, that's a good first step. But in my mind, it didn't seem to be enough. And so I continued to work in this field for quite a few years. And at this point now, I've been working in this field for several decades. But I started to get more and more discouraged. At a certain point, I had a crisis of faith. And I basically felt, I'm not sure it's ethical to teach business ethics. Because is it ethical to talk to students about how important ethics is and to give them all these experiences with these thorny, complex ethical business dilemmas and have them talk about what's right, what could we possibly do, and then send them out into a world where I wasn't sure it was actually possible to act on that. So I started to think it was all just kind of a facade. And I stepped away from it for a little while, and I started doing other things because I really did feel like, I don't know if I believe in this anymore. But then I had the good fortune of having I was doing consulting to business schools around the world on curriculum development and faculty development, and I was lucky enough to get a gig with Columbia Business School. And this was like in the late, 1999, 2000, 2001, right around that time. And they were trying to do a number of things in their curriculum around leadership, and so I was there to work with the faculty. But one of the things they were doing, and I had not been the author of this, they had come up with this on their own, but I happened to be there when they were doing it, is that they were asking their entire incoming cohort of MBA students, which at that time was about 600, and they were asking them all upon matriculation, so this is before they've taken any classes, but right around the time of orientation, they were asking them to write a little one-page essay and answered the question, tell me about a time or describe a time when your values conflicted with what you were asked to do in the workplace and how you handled it. So because I was doing consulting there at the time, I had the opportunity to read these essays, and I had the opportunity to read them over several years. So I read over 1,000 of these essays. And I worked with a group of people, and we were organizing them and trying to figure out what we could learn from them. And we learned a number of things. So first of all, we learned that I can probably count on one hand the number of people who didn't have a story to tell. So, everybody had had the experience, multiple times usually, of having their values conflict with what they were either asked to do explicitly or implicitly expected to do in their jobs. Secondly, keep in mind that the students who come to the MBA program at Columbia, they tended at that point to have 5-6 years of work experience. And they tended to represent disproportionately certain industries. So there were a lot of people from this is New York, and there were a lot of people from financial services, a lot of people from management consulting, a good group from high tech and pharma. So there were certain industries that were represented or overrepresented in the group. So because of this, as you read these little essays, the kinds of values conflicts they were encountering started to get really repetitious. Okay, you started to know, the same stories kept coming up again and again. I was pressured to either inflate or deflate my billable hours. I was pressured to distort the equations I was using to evaluate the financial attractiveness of a particular transaction in the service of whatever my organization wanted to promote with the client. Or I was being pressured to kind of puff up the capabilities of a product maybe beyond where it actually really was at that point. So they tended to be the same kinds of scenarios again and again. What was interesting, though, was that the responses were not the same. So we found that the responses tended to fall into basically 3 groups. 4 groups if you break them down a little more subtly. I'll tell you about them. Now, keep in mind, this is not a scientific study, right? This is self-reporting, but it was provocative. So the first group, the largest group, a little less than half of the people that we were reading these essays from said, yes, I encountered a time when my values conflicted with what I was told to do. And it bothered me, but I really didn't think I had any options. So I just sucked it up and I did what they told me to do. Okay? Then there was a small group of people who said, yes, I encountered this kind of situation and it did bother me. In fact, it bothered me so much that I couldn't do it. But I didn't really feel like I had any options, so I just removed myself from the situation. So they either quit, or sometimes they got themselves transferred to another manager within the same firm, outside of that work group. But then there was another group, about a third of the whole group, who said, yes, I encountered this kind of values conflict, it bothered me, and I tried to do something about it. And a small group of those people said, I tried and I failed. I was unsuccessful. But about a quarter of the whole group said, I tried, and by my lights, I succeeded. So what was interesting to me was to sort of figure out, well, what's the difference between this group and the other groups? What was it that they knew? What was it that they felt? What was it they were able to do? Because the scenarios were the same. The situations they were encountering were the same. So what could we see? So we kept reading them and looking back and forth, and it didn't seem that one group was more morally troubled than the other group. It didn't seem like one group was kind of, bland and blasé about it, and the other group really cared, because they all sort of said these were troubling, difficult situations. It didn't seem that one group was more sophisticated or more politically savvy, more organizationally insightful. Some of the people who found successful ways to voice their values were really clever, and they came up with these amazing kind of win-wins. And some of them were just really clumsy and even naive in the way they did it. And we just kept trying to figure out what is different. In the end, the only thing that we could really point to was that the people who were able to voice and act on their values successfully in these situations were people who, at some point, they said something out loud, outside of their own heads, about what was going on. It was just not an internal dialogue. And they may have started out talking to a family member or a friend, but eventually it got into the organization and it changed the whole trajectory of what happened. So we were looking at these, and it reminded me of some research that I had seen long ago when I was still back at HBS. And this was research that had been done about altruism and moral courage. And the people who did this research, Perry London and Douglas Hunneke, had looked at rescuers, people who had risked their lives during World War II to try and save people who were at risk during the Holocaust. And they interviewed them in depth, and they were trying to figure out what was different about these people, because there were so many people who had not done that. And they had a whole list of things they identified. But the one that always stayed with me, probably because I'm an educator, was that these people all talked about at an earlier point in their lives, when they were young adults, in their teens or in their 20s, with someone they respected, a parent, a teacher, a mentor, a boss. They had had the experience of rehearsing out loud, what would you do if, and then certain kinds of moral conflicts, and they would pre-script themselves. They would actually create the scripts and rehearse saying them out loud. Now, of course, they hadn't anticipated the Holocaust, but they did have the opportunity to practice expressing themselves around values with people who stood in as the people that they would need to convince or persuade or stand up to. So that was really basically just the kind of kernel of insight that we started to think maybe all the time we spend in business ethics classes teaching about how to figure out what's right, in all these little scenarios we read, the students knew what they thought was right, and they knew that they were being asked to violate it. They just didn't always know that they could do anything different about it. So that was the origin of this. And so then we got some support, as Len was explaining to you, and started to do some further research. So We looked at the scholarship, we looked at ethics literature, we looked at social science research, we looked at social psychology, we looked at decision making, we looked at cognitive neuroscience. And then we also started interviewing people. And we interviewed everyone from MBA students to CEOs. And we were asking them the same question. Tell me about a time when your values conflicted with what you were asked to do and how you handled it. Now, it was not just a blanket survey. It was really a survey where we were going to people through a kind of snowball technique. We were going to people who had been identified as someone who had a good story to tell. So we were going to people who we had been told had had opportunities or situations where they had successfully voiced their values. What was interesting is when I would talk to them about it, they'd say, well, Mary, I'll tell you that story. But before I tell you that story, I want to also tell you about some times when I did not voice my values. So these were not people who wanted to present themselves as good, you know? They wanted to present themselves honestly in terms of they did and they didn't voice their values at certain points in their lives. But one of the most interesting things that I learned from these conversations was what we don't do in business ethics education. And the story I like to tell to illustrate that is this one CEO I was interviewing. And he was an entrepreneur. He had started his own business. He was very successful, but it was privately held. And he said that whenever he hired an MBA, the last interview, when they were ready to offer the job, he would do the last interview whenever it was an MBA. And he said that he had recently been planning to make an offer to a guy who was an MBA from one of the top schools. And he said when the guy came in, he was asking him questions, and he said, did you take a business ethics class when you were doing your MBA? And the guy said, yes, it was required. We all took it. And so the CEO said, well, tell me what you learned. And he said, well, we learned all the models of ethical reasoning, you know, deontology, utilitarianism, virtue-based ethics, etc. And then we learned that whenever you encounter a values conflict or an ethical conflict in the workplace, you decide what you think you want to do, and then you pick the model of ethical reasoning that will most effectively support the position that you want to take. Now, the guy who was telling me the story, the CEO, was kind of telling it with a wry sense of humor, but it was a really, I think, an interesting point. Because what I have found, and what I see in business ethics classes, is that we tend to do two things primarily. We tend to build awareness, we call it, which is exposing you to the kinds of ethical conflicts you might encounter in the workplace, just in case you might not notice them when they come up. Now, that's could be effective because obviously in a rapidly changing world and in a globalizing world, there are some scenarios that no one predicted, right? They're new. But the ones that make the front page of the paper and the ones that make everyone decry the lack of ethics in business people are not the ones where it was that hard to figure out that there was a problem here. They're the ones where you probably did have a sense that something was wrong, but maybe didn't think there was anything possible to do about it. So I think that although awareness building is a useful thing, it's not sufficient. And then the second thing we tend to do in business ethics education is focus on analysis. And that's the piece that the CEO is talking about. We teach people models of ethical reasoning so they can discipline their thinking. Now, again, who's going to argue with rigorous thinking, right? I mean, it's a good thing. And there is the fact that many of us are likely to think we know what's right and maybe are being a little insensitive or maybe don't understand everything about the situation or are operating from a limited set of perspectives. And so it is good to discipline our reasoning. But it also is not enough. So it seemed to us that what was really needed was the third A, which is action. And that's really what we were seeing from that research by Hunneke in London, is that if you have the opportunity to prescript yourself and to rehearse this, you may be more likely to actually say it. So that was the heart of this, the beginning of this. But then we started looking at what we could really learn from talking to people. And we talked to a lot of different people who were at all different levels in organizations, people who were starting right out after school, BAs or MBAs, and people who were CEOs and everything in between. And we learned a number of things. One thing we learned right off the bat was that no matter where you were in the organization, you knew that that was the place where it was impossible to voice your values from. So, for example, if you were very junior in the organization, people would say, well, yes, I have values, and I care about these things, but I can't really do anything because I don't have any legitimacy in the organization, I don't have any relationships, any power, any real authority, no credibility yet. When I get to be CEO, I can act on these things. And then we would interview CEOs, and they'd say, well, sure, Mary, I'd like to be able to do these things. But, if I were more junior in the organization, I had less at stake, I could take these kinds of risks. But I've got, 100,000 people's lives, on, who depend on me. I can't take these kinds of chances with their lives. And then I would interview people in the middle of the organization who would say, well, I'd like to act on my values, but I'm getting squeezed from the top and the bottom. So what we found is that there were reasons and rationalizations why people said they couldn't voice and act on their values, no matter where they were in the organization. We also, however, found people at all of those levels who had, in fact, voiced and acted on their values. But they'd framed the situation differently. So then we started to think, well, what can we learn from the people who have done this effectively? And we basically found 7 pillars, 7 things that seem to be important. And I think I'll be able to go through them quickly. The first one is really just the idea of values itself. And one of the things that we would hear is that you can't do this because values differ across culture, across time. There's not a lot of shared value when you're operating in a global world. But what we did is we looked at a lot of the research that had been done on values. And what we found is that, sure, there are cultural differences. A lot of the cultural differences have to do with style. A lot of them have to do with method of communicating. But there are cultural differences around values. But what we also found is that there tend to be, across time and across region, a core set of values that are pretty much universally shared, hypernorms, if you will. So we found that, yes, there is a common ground where you can talk across distance. However, the second piece is we found out it was a really, really short list. So that has some interesting implications. It means that there may be the grounds for conversation. It also means that you need to think carefully about what values you're trying to appeal to when you're trying to make an argument to promote what you think is the right thing to do in a particular situation. You need to think about whether this is a widely shared value or not. The second pillar had to do with choice. And what we found is a lot of people said, well, I don't really have a choice. But then we also started really probing that. And as I said, when we interviewed people about people who had been identified because they had taken some gutsy moves, they all said, well, I want to tell you about the time when I didn't voice my values too. And so what we started to realize is that this is not about good people and bad people. This is about people. And that all of us, and I have yet to encounter someone who would disagree with this, but maybe I will, but that all of us have, at some points in our lives, found a way to voice and act on our values when we encountered conflicts. But all of us have also had times when we failed to do so. And so what we do at the beginning of this approach is we kind of say, look, this is not about identifying who's good in this room and who's bad in this room. It's about figuring out when you want to voice and act on your values, how can you learn to do so more effectively? How can you make it more likely that you can behave the way you'd like to behave? One of the things that we learned is that there's something that I call preemptive rationalizations, which is basically that when we encounter values conflicts, a lot of times we just already know it's not possible to act on that. And so before we even think about how you would script and act on it, we come up with arguments, even unconsciously, about why it's not really that wrong anyways, And you know what all those arguments are. They were in some of the readings you did for today. But we come up with it's what's expected, it's the norm, it's not that big a deal, I don't want to hurt my friend. There's a lot of arguments we come up with. But what we began to realize is that these were preemptive rationalizations, that if you actually believe that it might be possible to get it done effectively, then those kinds of rationalizations start to go away. And that's part of what we heard from people. In fact, what we started to realize is that if you think about people in business, you can kind of think of a bell curve. And if you put at one end of the bell curve people you would describe as idealists, people who will act on their own material, who will act on their values regardless of the impact on their material self-interest. And then you put at the other end of the bell curve people who we might call opportunists, people who will do what they think will maximize their personal self-interest regardless of values. And then if you say there's another group, we'll call them pragmatists, people who would act, who would like to act on their values if they felt that it didn't put them at a systematic disadvantage to do so. Now notice I'm not saying that it means that they know they would always be effective. It just means they think they have a shot, that they have as good a shot at being effective as they, as they might at any other business risk that they take. And so if you think about that bell curve, our hypothesis with the Giving Voice to Values curriculum and approach is that the majority of people, probably the majority of people, but certainly the majority of people who come to business schools probably identify as pragmatists. There'll be some people who will say I'm an idealist. There may be some people who will say I'm an opportunist. But our target are the pragmatists. We're not really trying to change anybody. If you don't really want to do what's right, I don't really believe that I'm going to change you. What I'd like to do is to speak to those of you who would like to do what you think is right, but just don't know if it's feasible. That's the audience for this. So that's what we decided that's what we were talking about when we talk about the pillar of choice. Then we also talked about something called normalization. And what we meant by that is that the people who were able to voice and act on their values tended to be people who didn't see these as extraordinary choices. They didn't get that deer in headlight feeling where, oh shit, oh darn, I'm in the middle of this ethical conflict and I just want to get through it quickly and get back to doing my real reason for being here, get back to business. These were people who actually saw this as part of doing business. I remember interviewing one guy. I won't tell you the whole story. I can tell you later in the class if you're interested. But he was in a situation where he ended up lying. And he said to me, Mary, when I was asked this question, I lied. And then he paused and he said, instinctively, I lied. And then he said he went home and he thought about it. And he thought, the kind of business I'm in, I'm going to be asked that very same question all the time. So I need to decide, am I comfortable with thinking that my response, my best response for the rest of my career, as long as I'm in this field, is to always lie? Or is there something else I can do? And so he decided, this is not so extraordinary. I was stunned in the moment and I instinctively lied, but I have a chance to think through this. So he actually reflected. He came up with a script that he was comfortable with, that he felt he could deliver credibly, that was honest. And then he felt that he could use that on an ongoing basis. So it became his default. And it actually was an opportunity for him to behave in a principled way in a common business situation. So part of what this is all about is normalizing it. If you normalize it, and I've got lots of stories about that, it just brings the energy down and it doesn't freak you out. And you don't get so emotional, so you don't have to villainize the person you're talking to either. And then they're not such a bad guy. They're just somebody else that you have to have a conversation with, just the way you try and persuade anyone of anything in your business career. So then the next pillar we had was purpose. And what we found is that the people who were able to voice and act on their values tended to be people who defined their purpose in terms of their personal purpose, their careers, their professions, and their wider societal impact. They tended to do two things. They defined their purpose broadly, and they defined it explicitly. And what I mean by that is that if you're in a business where you're only focusing on, the transaction cost today, or the success of the transaction today, then it's quite easy to lose focus on what kind of impact you're having over time and over space in terms of your wider career implications. But if you define what you're trying to achieve more broadly, and you name it that way, it makes it easier to stay true to what you really believe in. It also gives you some arguments. And what I found is that it wasn't that people were coming up with these broad purposes in some sort of sanctimonious way. It was more that that's just how they liked to think about their careers. They wanted to think that their careers were about something more than winning today. They wanted to think that their careers were about doing something big. They were actually often tended to be people who had a lot of ambition, but they wanted to do something big and worthwhile. And in their minds, they were defining doing something big and worthwhile is not simply about keeping score today. And so that was interesting to me, because I hadn't thought of it as this idea of having something big that you wanted to do. So then another pillar was, we call it self-assessment and alignment. And what this is about is, in a lot of ethics education, what people will do is they'll do what they call values clarification. Some of you may have done these kinds of exercises where people have to figure out what's important to them. And I can tell you, everybody always says, oh, you've got to do this with students because they don't know what's important to them. They don't know what their values are. And I think that's baloney. Because, in fact, when you do these exercises, everybody comes up with mom and apple pie. People comes up, they come up with the hypernorms I was talking about earlier. Honesty, respect, integrity, compassion, wisdom. They tend to come up with some core values. So our self-assessment in this curriculum is not about what you value. It's about how you most effectively can perform. So what we found in the people we interviewed is that there were a number of characteristics that were really critical for them to be effective. One of them was how they defined their risk profile, whether they were risk takers or whether they were risk averse. Another one was whether they were more comfortable operating autonomously or whether they like to work collaboratively. Another one was their communication style. Were they introverted, were they extroverted? Did they like to argue, or did they like to ask questions? Did they like to sort of assess everything and do their analysis and then come in with a response? Or did they like to just get in there in the mix and have a conversation? And then another one was purpose, which we talked about before, how they define their purpose. What we found, though, is that I came into this with some assumptions. I thought, as an introvert, that being extroverted would help. If you were and being a risk taker would help, because you'd feel like you could, get in there and challenge people. What I found is that for some people, that worked. There were people I talked to who said, the reason I was able to effectively do this is because I've always embraced risk, and I'm ready to take a chance and be assertive, and I went in there and stood up for what I cared about. And then there's other people I interviewed. One woman I interviewed, she was at Goldman Sachs, and I'll never forget, she'd done what I thought was kind of gutsy. And when I asked her how she was able to do it, she paused and she said, well, I've always been a fearful person. And I was sort of stunned, because it didn't seem to me like a fearful person would do these things. But what she did is she framed her challenges in a way that it was consistent with who she thought she was, that the cautious way to behave was, in fact, to act on her values. So what I started to think is, if we preach to someone who sees themselves as shy and fearful, that you need to be bold, or if we preach to someone who sees themselves as a real risk taker and very assertive, you need to be more cautious and conservative, we're not going to get very far. But if instead we just teach people, if you see yourself that way, frame your values conflict in a way that requires that kind of an approach, and that's what these people did, then you're more likely to be able to do it effectively. The sixth pillar is voice, and this was the one I mentioned earlier that we were learning from a lot of research, that it's important to actually not just think about these things, but to say them out loud and to rehearse them and to get peer coaching with them. You literally lay down neural pathways. It becomes your muscle memory. It becomes a default position. And that if you've said these arguments to your peers with peer coaching, it becomes much easier to voice them when you're in the workplace and you're in the situation. And the last pillar is what we call reasons and rationalizations, which was kind of what the HBR piece that you read for today was based on, where we identified that there were a number of core reasons or rationalizations that people tend to use when they're saying why you can't act on your values, and that these are both predictable and vulnerable to response. And so if you actually think about them in advance, there's certain kinds of stock responses. Now, I'm winding down, but I wanted to just say one thing about those stack responses, which is that one of the things we found, I always thought, as someone who was, as I said, kind of introverted, that I couldn't argue with these things unless I had the perfect argument, because it seemed that the received wisdom, it seemed that what everyone assumed about business was that you couldn't do these things. And so I felt like I needed to have the perfect silver bullet kind of argument in order to be able to act on my values. And that's why I had that crisis of faith I was talking about earlier, because I didn't think I had the perfect silver bullet response. However, when I interviewed people who had done this and done this successfully, they had good arguments. But if you didn't want to agree with them, you could just say, well, there's a flaw in that argument. It wasn't perfect. The thing was that the arguments for not acting on their values were imperfect as well. And it was just easier to go with those because they were the default. And so part of what we learned from this is that you need to be willing to just say them and recognize they don't have to be perfect. Because the people who did it successfully, they weren't perfect. And it still worked out. So one of the things we did is we started to see what has worked with people, and we learned that A, it's not always easy, B, it doesn't always work. There's no promises here. But we also learned that it's like a skill, like anything else, and that if you practice it, you get better at it, and it becomes a default kind of position. So that was sort of really basically the heart of this, and we started creating a curriculum. We developed exercises and cases and readings. I used to run the case writing program at Harvard Business School, and I'm sure you've read that type of case study in the past. But they tend to be about 20 pages long, and they tend to end with the CEO sitting back in usually his chair and looking out the window and putting his arms behind his head and saying, what should I do? That's the case, right? These cases are really different. They're a page, 2 pages long. And they end with the protagonist in the case has already decided what he or she thinks is the right thing to do. And the question at the end of the case is not, what should I do? It's, this is what I think is right. How can I get it done? And not only how can I get it done, but what do I need to say? And to whom? And in what sequence? And then what will they say back? And then what do I say? It was very interesting. One of the first places where we piloted this was at Yale. And we piloted it in a corporate governance class. It was an elective in the School of Management. And the guy who was teaching the course was Ira Milstein, who's a pretty well-known corporate governance lawyer, attorney, advisor. And Ira had heard about what I was doing and said, oh, this is intriguing, Mary. I'm developing this new course. We're going to teach the students. The MBA is all about the economic theory and the legal theory behind corporate governance, purpose of the firm. And then we're going to teach them about Sarbanes-Oxley and how that's changed the rules. And then we're going to show some of the research about what has changed on boards in terms of composition and how that may or may not have improved things. But he said, I want to end the course with something practical. And I want to end it with some best practices for board behavior. So when they're on corporate boards, they'll be able to think about this. And he said, I think the giving voice to values approach might be an interesting way to do that. So he invited me to spend a day with him and some of his senior partners at their law firm in New York City. And they just regaled me with stories about different kinds of ethical conflicts that they had encountered when they were advising boards of large major corporations. And then we picked 2 scenarios that we thoroughly disguised, and we wrote them up as a GVV-style case. The protagonist knew what he thought was right. How was he going to get it done? What would he say? And then he went into the class, and he broke the class into 2 groups. And he broke each of the groups into teams of 4 or 5 students. And half the class got one of the cases, and half the class got the other case. And they were supposed to go off and work in teams and create the scripts and come back and share them in the class, and then do peer coaching. So the first day, the first group came in. And this is the first time that the scripting approach was used in a classroom that I was observing. So I was pretty nervous about it, really hoping it would work, didn't know if it would. And I was observing. So the students came in and they did their presentation. And I was really bummed because they were good, little impassioned speeches. They were well analyzed. They had identified all the arguments on all the sides. They'd come up with, an effective argument, they thought. And then they presented it. And, Ira seemed happy, but at the end he said, Mary, do you have anything you want to say to the class? And I said, well, I think you did some really nice, good little impassioned speeches, but from all the interviews I've done, that's not how this happens. Very rarely does someone give a good speech and then everything changes. It's a conversation, it's a process. And you say your best argument, but then someone's going to say something back. And you have to be ready to take it to the next step. And I said, it's more like a decision tree of scripts than just one argument. So the second group, obviously, had the benefit of hearing that. So they went off and did their practice on their cases. They came in the next day. And they said, we're at Yale. Yale's known for what? A theater school. So we decided the best way to do this was to actually create the characters and talk about the motivation and then show you how this conversation will go. And they actually did the kind of back and forth, but they didn't just do it as a PowerPoint. They did it, they played the roles and they did it. And it was the most exciting class that I'd ever been in. And it was really interesting. And there were 4 or 5 different teams, and they all came up with a different approach, including the last team who came up with a very well thought out approach and then concluded that they didn't think it would work. But they said that they still were really glad they had thought it through in that way. And I think that's kind of, for me, the heart of giving voice to values is that it's not about being Pollyanna. It's not about saying this will always work. It's just about saying, just like anything else you learn in business school, you don't know it's going to work. You're just giving it your best shot. And you're doing a kind of rigorous, thorough research, and you're practicing your presentation or your pitch, and you're getting comfortable with it. And we don't do that with ethics. And so that's really the heart of this approach. So I'm going to stop here. I'm happy to talk to you about how it's being used in other places, answer questions you might have, or just hear any stories you have. But thank you for letting me talk about it, because I like to.
Do you want to take some quick questions here before we go through them? Please, go ahead.
Any comments, questions, suggestions? Yep. Give us an advanced flavor.
What are some of the common rationalizations that people use to justify doing, say, the wrong thing or something that's ethically questionable?
Yeah, there's a lot of them, but the 4 that I hear most frequently are, it's not material, it doesn't rise to the level of being important enough. It's not my responsibility, I'm either too low in the organization or I'm off on the side. I would like to do this, but I don't want to offend my peers. I don't want to hurt my team. I don't want to damage their bonuses. And then there's one more: responsibility, materiality. It'll come to me before we get to the other room. And then there's a few others that come up now and then, but aren't as common, like we don't have time. And what's interesting about that one is that some of the people I interviewed said that's how they got the right thing done, is that they would say to people, we don't have time to come up with a plan that's going to make this work. We really have to just be honest. We don't have the time to think through what might be the implications of distorting whatever the issue was. So that was sort of interesting to me, because often people say we don't have time to do the right thing. A number of the people I interviewed said they used that script when they were trying to say how they would do the right thing. But the other 4, the 4th one will come to me. It's in the HBR article. But those are the ones we hear most often. Yeah. And there are different variations on them, so. Other thoughts, questions? Yep.
Controversial, but I feel like sometimes not everyone should all the time act according to their bad. Sometimes I think that these things are holding you back actually should be holding you back.
Can you say a little more about what you mean by that? Sounds really intriguing.
I felt like if I was acting in accordance with my values,
Yeah.
I would do something. But I feel like sometimes I feel like I should hold back or something. And in retrospect, I said, yeah, I'm just pretty glad
That you did. Yeah. And is it you were glad you did because you found out you were actually wrong, or you were glad you did because you found out some?
I mean, I feel
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. Right, right. I think that's a really excellent point, and actually, it's a variation on a question I get a lot. One of the things I was going to ask you in the classroom is, what do you think are the most common questions I get when I present this? And one of the most common questions I get, which I think is related to what you're saying, is that people say, well, it's great that you teach people how to voice their values, but what if their values are wrong? Or what if they have bad values? Or some variation on that. And I've thought about that a lot, because as you may have been able to figure out, I'm very self-reflective about these and very scrupulous. Someone who had a crisis of faith about whether it's ethical to teach ethics is the kind of person who thinks about this. And so what I've come to believe about this is that, just as I was talking earlier about preemptive rationalizations, all the kind of arguments about why we can't act on our values come pretty easily. We learn them as 3- and 4-year-olds, It's kind of the natural, you don't tattle and, all those kinds of things you learn very young. It's much more difficult when you're bucking the system to voice a values-based position. And so what I have come to believe is that if we ask people to practice that and to get skillful at it, then I'm pretty confident that in the marketplace of free ideas, if your values are really bad, if other people are actually able to voice better values, that there'll be a pretty fair contest. But that what I've seen in classrooms in business and also in my consulting with businesses is that it's much easier to voice the cynical view. In fact, one of the impulses for developing this curriculum was that, and this was when I was back at HBS, that we would teach these ethics classes, and there always were students in the class who really were concerned about whatever the issue was, and who would try and speak up about it. But then there would be someone in the class who would say, oh yeah, sure, Mary, that's great, but I've been around the block, I've been in this kind of firm, you're not going to get anywhere if you try and do that. And so the way you showed you were smart, and the way you showed you were savvy, and that you had had some real political insights into organizations, was to voice the cynical view, or the view that it's not possible to behave in accordance with your values. So what I wanted to do was create a curriculum that's kind of a sleight of hand, that basically says, you don't have to think this is the right thing to do. You don't have to think this is what you would do. But we're just saying that this person in this case wants to do X. If you were him or her, how would you get it done? So then the way you show you're smart and the way you show you have some real organizational insight is you figure out how to do the thing that's impossible. So it just changes the dynamic of what the argument is in the classroom. You don't have to agree with it. The other piece that I think responds a little bit to what you're saying is that we have a sort of set of questions we ask people to go through to create these scripts. And the first question is, what's at stake for everybody, including yourself, but including the person you disagree with? And what sometimes happens is that people start to question the value they came in with just because they're starting to understand what's really at stake. In fact, what often happened with the people I was interviewing is that in the end, even though they may have still believed that they were doing the right thing, they stopped thinking that the person they were arguing with was doing the wrong thing or was a bad person. They started to think, he or she doesn't have all the information, he or she is being pressured by an organizational incentive system that is out of alignment, he or she has something else at stake that I was entirely unaware of. And so when they started to go through that exercise, they were able to create a script that didn't have to vilify the person they were arguing with or disagreeing with. It actually could be more of an approach that allowed them to work together to get to a solution. So I guess those are 2 or 3 ways of responding to what you're saying. It may not. Say back.
So I feel like there's like a difference between having values that you act upon or values that you like discuss and speak about. I guess what I'm thinking now, or what you've led me to think about, is maybe I should are times where if it was just up to me, I have this value, I want to do something, maybe that's more appropriate
I see.
for open discussion.
So if I'm giving the impression that values are just acting on your instincts, that's not what I mean to be doing. I tend to be a cognitive kind of gal. I tend to I think about things more than I should think about things. And this curriculum is based on doing a lot of thinking. It's simply thinking that allows you to actually say what you really value. And in the process of doing that, sometimes you end up realizing. So that does happen sometimes.
Yeah.
Say more. I mean, is that what you were saying? Or?
I don't know, I'm just, yeah, I see what you're saying. I do now agree that, like, if, it's good to express my values so that they can compete with each other and have, like, a fair thing, and they will change
Mm-hmm.
and take different forms. But I still feel that in instances of times where it's just up to me,
Mm-hmm.
where I'm not going to be talking to it,
Mm-hmm.
there is still a distinction that I have for myself between my instincts and my values.
Hmm.
And if I feel like I should hold back sometimes, that's not necessarily, there's not a value behind it, but I feel like I should repress something, or do something differently, that is not in accordance with what I believe my values are.
Yeah.
That I should listen to that too, I shouldn't just,
And that may well be true, and I think it's difficult for me to respond until I know an example of what you're talking about. It's hard for me to answer that in the abstract, but think about it. If you come up with an example, raise your hand again. Yep.
I'm thinking in connection with your question, maybe it builds on it. Did you find there was a temporal finding in terms of how someone sat with something? Because something you're implicitly saying, I think, is that you sit with the problem. So, right, and sometimes it goes away, sometimes you sit with it and go, wow, this isn't going to work for me, I need to do something. Did that come up in your interview? That there's some
It came up, maybe not the way you're talking about it, but it did come up because a lot of what you'd often hear from people is that I'm in a meeting, right? Or I'm in a conversation, maybe with my boss, and this thing comes up and I have this feeling it's not right. But it's going fast. And, everybody else seems to be fine with it. And they're all coming up with all the arguments, and I'm not sure I can argue at the time, and it all kind of just goes by. And so what you'll often hear from people then is, I missed my shot. I wasn't able to respond in the moment. So there's sort of two things that we've figured out about that. One is that this curriculum is about not having that happen quite as often, so that you're a little more facile with speaking. But the other is that we interviewed people who actually went back. There was one woman I remember who told this kind of compelling story about, she was in a room with all the senior executives of this firm, and they were making a pretty major investment strategy decision. And she thought it was wrong, and she thought it was wrong ethically in terms of what their obligations and their prior commitments were to certain constituencies. But it was one of these things that went very fast. Everyone else seemed to agree. The CEO was really invested, and she just didn't know what to say. And she said she went back and she realized, I'm in this room because they believe I have something to say. So I feel like I have to say it. And I wasn't able to say it in the room, but let me do some thinking about it. So what she did is she first of all, she left a voice message for her boss and said, there's something important I need to talk to you about before we move on this. Can I have an appointment? Can I have an appointment with you first thing tomorrow morning? So she kind of did that. And then she spent the rest of the day and the evening thinking about how to present her position. And she said that she thought about, when have I ever seen him change his mind? And what moved him to change his mind when he did? And she realized that this particular person needed to have the numbers, but he also needed a really good story. He needed like a compelling storyline, narrative. And so she spent the evening figuring out the numbers, but more importantly, she came up with a story of how this would work and what would happen for good or for ill, depending on which path they took. And then she went in and presented it. Now, she could have, it happened she succeeded, actually, but she might not have, it's just, that's why I got to her, because someone said she's got a good story, but, it wouldn't necessarily. But what I thought was learning about that was that missing the moment doesn't necessarily mean you've missed the whole opportunity, number one. And number two, I thought it was really an interesting insight about thinking about the person you need to influence, what has changed, what have you seen change his or her mind at other points? What works for that person? One person told me that they figured out that this person only listened to one other person. So he figured out that he didn't need to change the mind of his target audience. He needed to change the mind of the key influencer. And so he went there, and then through that, through that path, tried to have an impact. So I'm not exactly answering your question, but it triggered some other thoughts. So I guess I didn't specifically study what you were saying, but I did hear from people that time can work for and against you in different ways. The main lesson I've learned from this is that nothing is always good or always bad in terms of helping you or hurting you, that you just need to reframe it to work for you. So never be totally discouraged, but also don't think it's a cakewalk, and that you just have to frame the decision and your approach in a way that will play to the reality of the situation and to your own strengths. There's that story about, well, maybe I'll wait until the classroom because I know we're running out of time, but I have a great story about playing to your strengths. I can
Well,
share
we'll
later.
hold off.
We'll hold off.
And we'll get a great story as we go next door to class.